On Sunday, Argentina went to the polls for its congressional midterms, with roughly half of the seats in the lower house and a third of the seats in the upper house up for grabs. In what was widely seen as a make-or-break election for Argentina's embattled President Javier Milei, his La Libertad Avanza party outperformed the polls, beating the left-wing Peronist bloc by 10 points, and securing a fresh mandate for his radical platform of economic reform. So in this video, we're going to explain why this election was so crucial for Milei, the results, and what might happen next. So, to understand why these elections were so important for Milei, you need to understand the interplay between Milei's economic project and his political prospects. In short, the success of Milei's economic project has always relied on him remaining popular enough to convince investors and the markets that his reforms are actually going to stick. After all, even if they like Milei's policies, foreign investors aren't going to invest in Argentina and aid its economic recovery if they think Milei is just going to be replaced by another spendthrift Peronist in a couple of years' time, as usually happens in Argentina. Originally, it looked like things were going pretty well. Milei's approval ratings held high for most of his first year, and he made impressive progress balancing both Argentina's fiscal and trade deficits. This allowed him to get a fair bit of legislation through Argentina's Congress, despite the fact that the La Libertad Avanza party only held about 15% of the seats in the lower chamber. And that's because opposition parties were wary of being seen to obstruct a popular and apparently effective president. There was also some hope in Milei's camp that his original success might give way to a virtuous cycle, whereby his impressive approval ratings would convince investors that his reforms would stick, who would then pour money into Argentina, driving economic growth and pushing up Milei's own popularity, etc., etc. However, in the past couple of months, the reverse has started happening, and instead of a virtuous cycle, Milei has apparently got stuck in a sort of vicious cycle. This really kicked off after a series of corruption scandals earlier in the year, which triggered a decline in Milei's approval ratings, and his party were then punished at the Buenos Aires provincial elections in early September, where they lost to the left-wing Peronists by 13 points. Worried that Milei's reforms would soon be stymied by the Peronists, foreign investors and anxious Argentinians responded by selling Argentinian assets, especially Argentina's currency, the peso. This was bad news for Milei, not least because a sharp devaluation in the peso would stoke inflation, increasing the cost of imports, undoing perhaps his most notable economic achievement, namely the stabilization of Argentina's monthly inflation rate. Now, Milei tried to stem the peso's decline by essentially hiking interest rates, but this put the brakes on Argentina's already stagnant economy, and was ultimately insufficient. When the peso continued to decline, Milei then had to directly intervene and spend dollars buying up pesos. But this was clearly unsustainable, given Argentina's meager foreign exchange reserves. At this point, it looked like Milei was well and truly stuck in a vicious cycle, whereby his falling approval ratings were triggering market sell-offs, which were in turn undermining his economic project, thus pushing his approval ratings down even further. However, in late September, Milei was thrown a lifeline when the US announced that they were essentially bailing him out by providing a $20 billion swap line, which allows Argentina to convert pesos to dollars at a constant exchange rate. When this didn't stop the sell-off, the Trump administration took things a step further and literally spent hundreds of millions of dollars buying up pesos on currency markets. Now, both Milei and Trump would have been hoping that this support would get him out of this vicious cycle by providing some economic relief ahead of the midterms. But things didn't go perfectly to plan here. Not only did the peso continue to fall, reaching a new low of about 1,500 to the dollar last week, but the fact that he needed a bailout in the first place has undermined Milei's appeal as sort of an economic savant, and instead made him look more like your typical Argentinian politician, beset by corruption scandals and economic crisis. Moreover, the Trump administration's decision to condition support on a strong showing for Milei at the midterms caused a bit of a political storm. For context, Trump basically said he'd withdraw support if Argentinians didn't vote for Milei, telling reporters earlier this month, quote, "If Milei wins, we're staying with him, and if he doesn't, we're gone. We're not going to waste our time." Unsurprisingly, this didn't go down well with the opposition, who accused the US of interfering with Argentina's internal affairs, with the Peronist leader declaring that, quote, "The Argentine economy is being managed with a remote control by the Treasury of the United States." Polls going into the election showed that Milei's lead had essentially evaporated, with both the La Libertad Avanza party and the Peronist Fuerza Patria coalition on about 37%. In the end, however, the polls were way off, and La Libertad Avanza ended up beating Fuerza Patria by about 10 points. As of Monday morning, with about 99% of the votes counted, La Libertad Avanza were on about 41%, while Fuerza Patria were on about 32%. Because it was only the midterms, only about half of the 257 seats in Argentina's lower chamber, the Chamber of Deputies, were up for grabs, as were about a third of the seats in the upper house, the Senate. Projections suggest that Milei's party won 64 seats in the Chamber of Deputies and 12 in the Senate, which would give him a total of 101 seats in the lower house and 20 in the upper. While he clearly doesn't have an outright majority, Milei now has at least a 1/3 blocking minority in the Chamber of Deputies, which essentially means that his presidential vetoes against opposition legislation cannot be overruled by a 2/3 majority in Congress. Without a majority though, he'll still need support from opposition parties to pass legislation, but he's been pretty successful at this in the past, and his impressive performance at this election should make things easier for him. You get the idea then. Sunday's elections went pretty brilliantly for Milei, and to top it all off, because of this ongoing interplay between Milei's political prospects and his economic project, it's also been great news for the peso. While the Argentinian exchanges weren't open at the time of writing, on the crypto-based currency exchanges, where the Argentine peso trades 24 hours, the peso has strengthened about 10% against the dollar, trading at just over 1,300 to the dollar. This means that Milei should be able to just let the peso float, inflation won't surge, and he could probably start building back his foreign exchange reserves. All in all, while the best strategy was probably just to avoid the corruption scandals that got him in trouble in the first place, Milei's gamble of artificially boosting the peso to give him an electoral boost seems to have paid off handsomely. And this is also pretty great news for the US Treasury, which will now be able to sell its new peso holdings back for dollars without making a loss. Before you go, we've just announced our new coffee table book, Assembly Required, a 300-page book which highlights 27 of the world's most beautiful parliament buildings, from the classics like the British Parliament in Westminster, to the US Capitol or the Hungarian Parliament, to ones you might not expect, like New Zealand, Bhutan or Bangladesh. For each parliament, we don't just show beautiful photos of these actually incredible buildings, we also tell you the stories behind the buildings, both through passages written by our team, as well as through detailed custom-designed floor plans and diagrams. We really did spend a long time on this too. We spent ages digging into the stories of parliament buildings all around the world, before narrowing it down to just the most interesting and beautiful buildings, writing tens of thousands of words to tell you their stories. We've also made both desk and wall calendars based on Assembly Required too, allowing you to experience these beautiful buildings year-round. Both are also double-sided, providing tons of bonus images for you to enjoy. If you're interested, you can click the link in the description to find out more. Plus, there's a whole load of bundles available if you want a good deal. Plus, if you do want a copy, then you can get 15% off anything Assembly Required by using the code ASSEMBLY. That code only lasts for this week, so if you're interested, now's your time. Anyway, this is just another way that you can help fund our journalism. So if you are interested, then your support will help us to continue investing in our journalism, as well as providing free content for years to come. So as always, thank you very much.